This is the story of Gideon, a man who thought he was too weak and scared to do anything important, but learned that God uses the weak and hesitant when they depend on his strength. Once upon a time, under a moonlit sky, Gideon lay flat on his stomach in a field, his heart beating so loudly he was sure someone could hear it. Nearby, the Midianite camp glowed with small fires. Shadows of soldiers moved across tents, their voices rising and falling like a restless sea. Their camels snorted and stomped, and every now and then a loud laugh rang out. Gideon pressed his cheek into the dirt and closed his eyes, trying to breathe quietly. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered to himself. "What am I doing? I'm not a warrior. I'm a nobody." His mind drifted back to his childhood. He remembered sneaking out to help his father fix broken tools or repair the family's small stone walls. He was always careful, always quiet, always trying to stay out of trouble. His family was the smallest clan in their tribe, and Gideon was the youngest, the least important. Whenever there was a big job, he was the last one they called. Whenever there was danger, he was the first to hide. When the Midianites started raiding their fields, stealing grain and animals, Gideon learned to stay low and move fast. He spent hours hiding behind rocks, gathering leftover stalks of wheat to feed his family. Even now, he remembered his father saying, "Gideon, you're not a fighter. You're a helper. Stay safe." But tonight was different. Tonight, he was closer to the enemy than ever before. He peeked over a rock, watching the Midianite soldiers laugh and roast meat over the fires. Their swords gleamed in the firelight. Gideon's hands shook. He wished he could just disappear, become a tiny bug in the grass. Then, in that tense moment, a voice stronger than the roar of all the soldiers whispered in his heart, "Gideon!" He froze, eyes wide. "You are a mighty warrior," the voice said again, echoing softly but powerfully inside him. "The Lord is with you." Gideon's breath caught. "A warrior?" he thought desperately. "I'm the weakest in my whole family. I can't even stand up straight when I'm nervous. Why me?" He pressed his forehead into the ground, shaking from head to toe. But somehow, even as fear wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, a tiny spark lit inside. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about being the strongest or the bravest. Maybe it was about being chosen. Gideon clenched his fists in the dirt. And in that dark field, surrounded by enemies and doubts, a scared young man started to hear the first whispers of the impossible plan God had for him. Gideon crawled backward from the Midianite camp, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. When he reached the safety of a small grove of trees, he collapsed onto his knees, gasping for air. He looked up at the stars shining above him, each one blinking calmly as if they had no idea how terrified he felt. "God, are you sure about this?" he whispered, voice cracking. "Me? A mighty warrior? You've got the wrong guy." Gideon stumbled back to his father's house. The old stone walls felt cold under his hand as he leaned against them. His mind spun with the words he'd heard, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." He shook his head hard. "I'm not a warrior," he muttered. "I'm a wheat thresher. I hide in pits and behind rocks. I'm no leader." Inside he found a small wool fleece lying near the door. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands. Then an idea sparked in his mind, half desperation, half hope. "God," he whispered, staring at the fleece, "if you really want me to save Israel, prove it to me. I need to know this isn't just my imagination." He carried the fleece outside and laid it on the ground. "In the morning," he continued shakily, "if there's dew only on this fleece and the ground is dry, then I'll know you're really speaking to me." His hands trembled as he stepped back. That night, he barely slept. He tossed and turned, his heart wrestling with every what if. What if the fleece stays dry? What if God leaves me alone after all? When dawn finally came, Gideon rushed outside. He reached down and grabbed the fleece. It was soaking wet, heavy with dew. Water dripped down his arms as he squeezed it. The ground all around, dry as dust. His mouth fell open. His chest felt tight, but still, he was scared. He set the fleece down again, knees knocking together. "God, please don't be mad," he whispered. "But can I ask you one more time, just to be sure?" This time, he breathed deeply, trying to steady his shaking voice. "Tomorrow. Make the fleece dry and the ground all around it covered in dew." That night, the stars watched again as Gideon lay awake, eyes wide open. When morning light finally stretched across the field, he ran out and grabbed the fleece, dry, and the ground around it sparkled wet with dew. Gideon fell to his knees, his eyes stung with tears. "It's really you," he whispered. "You're really calling me." In that quiet moment, surrounded by dew and the morning breeze, Gideon finally began to believe that maybe, just maybe, God really could use someone as scared and small as him to do something big. Gideon stood on a rocky hill, squinting down at the valley below. The sun climbed higher, and he could see the Midianite camp sprawled out like a giant blanket, countless tents, camels, and soldiers everywhere. His heart thudded in his chest just looking at it. Behind him, men began to gather. At first it was a few, neighbors, friends, cousins. Then more came, drawn by the news that Gideon, the quiet wheat thresher, was leading a fight against the enemy. Gideon tried to stand tall as they arrived. Some of the men looked at him with excitement, others with doubt. A big man named Jathan slapped Gideon on the back. "Finally! We'll show those Midianites who's boss." Another warrior, lean and fast, leaned on his spear. "How many are we now? Thousands, right? We can crush them if we stick together." Gideon forced a small smile, but inside he felt like his knees might give out. He scanned the valley again, his mind racing. Then, suddenly, God spoke to his heart. "You have too many men, Gideon," the voice said calmly. Gideon blinked, almost dropping his sword. "Too many?" he whispered. "God, have you seen them? There are so many Midianites, they look like a swarm of locusts." But God's voice continued. "If you win with this many, Israel will boast, saying they saved themselves. Tell anyone who is afraid to go home." Gideon swallowed hard. He turned to face the eager crowd. "Listen," he called out, voice shaking. "If anyone is scared or worried, you're free to leave. Go back home." At first, no one moved. Then, slowly, men began to shuffle backward, glancing at each other nervously. One by one, groups turned and started the long walk home. By the end, 2/3 of the army was gone. Gideon stood there, jaw clenched, watching the dust rise behind the retreating men. He glanced at the remaining soldiers, only a small group now. They shifted on their feet, gripping their swords and looking at Gideon with wide eyes. Before he could catch his breath, God spoke again. "There are still too many." Gideon nearly fell over. "Still too many?" he gasped. God told him to take the men down to the water and watch how they drank. Some knelt down and plunged their faces into the water like animals. Others scooped the water with their hands and drank carefully, watching their surroundings. God pointed to the small group who used their hands. "Keep these. Send the rest home." When it was all over, only 300 men stood behind Gideon. He looked at them, his heart pounding louder than any battle drum. Just 300 against a countless army. Gideon closed his eyes, taking a shaky breath. "Okay, God," he whispered, voice small but determined. "It's your battle, not mine. I'll trust you." The men waited silently, eyes locked on Gideon. And though fear still tugged at his heart, Gideon felt something stronger beginning to grow. A quiet, steady courage that could only come from God. That night, Gideon lay on the ground staring up at the moon. His 300 men slept around him, their cloaks pulled tight against the cool air. The sound of soft snoring and the gentle rustle of grass filled the dark. But Gideon's mind wouldn't rest. He turned over again and again, hearing echoes of God's words, "I will be with you. You will strike them down as if they were one man." He pressed his face into his hands. "God, I want to believe you. But what if I fail? What if they all die because of me?" Just then, God spoke to his heart again. "Get up, Gideon. Go down into the enemy camp and listen. You will be encouraged." Gideon's eyes flew open. He sat up quickly, glancing at the men around him. His friend Purah stirred and looked at him sleepily. "Where are you going?" Purah whispered. Gideon took a deep breath. "To the Midianite camp. You're coming with me." Purah's eyes widened. "You mean into the camp with all those soldiers? Right now?" Gideon nodded. "Right now." They moved carefully through the shadows, slipping between rocks and tall grasses. Every step felt like thunder in Gideon's ears. His breath came out in quick, shallow bursts. Finally, they reached the edge of the Midianite camp. Fires glowed everywhere, and guards sat talking in low voices. Camels snorted and shifted their feet. Gideon and Purah crouched low behind a tent, barely daring to breathe. Just then, 2 Midianite soldiers stepped out of the tent nearby, deep in conversation. "I had the strangest dream last night," one soldier said, rubbing his forehead. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into our camp. It hit a tent with such force that the whole thing collapsed and fell flat." The other soldier's eyes grew wide. "That can only mean one thing. It's the sword of Gideon, the Israelite. God has given the whole camp into his hands." Gideon's mouth dropped open. He turned to Purah, eyes blazing with shock and excitement. "Did you hear that?" Gideon whispered, his voice shaking. "God has already given us the victory." Without waiting another second, Gideon dropped to his knees right there in the dirt. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, tears filling his eyes. "Thank you for speaking even through my enemies. I believe you." He stood up, new energy flooding his bones. "Come on, Purah," he said, gripping his friend's arm. "We have to get back. We have a battle to win." They ran back up the hill in the moonlight, hearts pounding, not with fear this time, but with a wild, unstoppable faith. That night, for the first time in his life, Gideon felt truly ready to lead. When Gideon and Purah reached the camp, the 300 men were starting to stir, rubbing sleep from their eyes and stretching in the cold dawn air. Gideon ran straight to the center of the group, his eyes shining brighter than the morning stars. "Get up!" He called out, his voice strong and clear. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into our hands." The men looked at each other, wide-eyed. A few of them tightened their grips on their swords nervously. Gideon, the big man from before, stepped forward and scratched his head. "So, we're going to charge down there and fight them head on, right?" Gideon shook his head quickly, almost laughing from excitement. "Number. We're not going down there with sword swinging. We're going to do it God's way. And it's going to shock them so much they'll run for their lives." He started handing out clay jars, each with a small torch hidden inside, and ram's horns, trumpets that usually signaled a charge. The men stared at the items, confused. Gideon?" one young man said hesitantly. "Did you forget to give us the actual weapons?" Gideon shook his head. "These are our weapons. Listen to me. We're going to split into 3 groups. When we reach the edge of the enemy camp, do exactly as I do. Smash the jars, hold up your torches, blow your trumpets, and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon!'" Gideon looked down at the jar and then back at Gideon. "You're serious?" Gideon nodded firmly. "Dead serious." The men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, but slowly they began to nod. One by one they picked up the jars and horns. Their faces were nervous, but under it, something new sparked. Trust. Gideon stood at the front, taking a deep breath. "This is not about our strength," he said, his voice softer now. "It's about God's power. Tonight, we'll show them that it's not the size of our army or the sharpness of our swords that wins battles. It's the Lord." Silence fell for a moment. Then one by one, men started to nod. A few even smiled. Gideon lifted his jar and horn high above his head. "For the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted first, and the others echoed after him, the sound echoing off the hills. Gideon felt courage flood through him like a rushing river. He gripped his torch tight and closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. "Tonight is yours." Then he opened his eyes, lifted his arm, and started forward toward the dark valley below, toward the enemy camp, toward the impossible, and toward the moment God would prove his strength through a man who once thought he was nothing. Under the cover of night, Gideon and his men moved down the hills like silent shadows. They crept along rocky paths, their breaths puffing in the cool air, their sandals crunching softly on the dry dirt. Each man held his clay jar tightly, careful not to make a sound. Gideon led the front group. Every few steps he turned and gave small hand signals to the others, his face lit faintly by the moon. When they reached the edge of the Midianite camp, they stopped. The valley below was alive with sounds: snoring soldiers, crackling fires, restless camels. Gideon crouched low behind a boulder. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum. He looked back at the men behind him. In the moonlight he could see their wide eyes and nervous hands shaking around the jars and trumpets. He whispered, "Get ready! When I break my jar and blow my horn, do the same, and shout with all your might." The men nodded, swallowing hard. A few closed their eyes and mouthed quick prayers. Gideon turned back toward the camp. This is it, he thought. No turning back now. He lifted his jar high above his head. For one moment, the whole valley felt frozen, as if even the stars were holding their breath. Then, smash! The sound of the jar shattering rang out sharp and loud in the night air. At the same time, Gideon lifted his torch high and blew his trumpet with all his strength. All around him the men smashed their jars, flames bursting into the darkness like sudden stars. Horns wailed through the hills, echoing like 1,000 cries. For the Lord and for Gideon, they all shouted together, voices roaring into the night. Down in the camp, chaos exploded instantly. Midianite soldiers leaped from their beds, crashing into each other, shouting and swinging swords wildly in every direction. Camels screamed and broke their tethers, stampeding through tents and knocking over fires. Confused and terrified, the soldiers began attacking each other, convinced they were surrounded by a massive army. Gideon's men stood on the hillsides, torches blazing, trumpets wailing, shouting over and over. Their voices carried through the night like a giant wave crashing down. Gideon felt the heat of his torch on his face, his trumpet still vibrating in his hand. He looked at the wild scene below, his heart nearly bursting. "It's working," he gasped to himself. "God, you did it! You really did it!" As the Midianites fled deeper into the valley, leaving everything behind, Gideon knew this wasn't a normal victory. This was a miracle. And in that moment, standing on the rocky hillside with a torch and a horn instead of a sword, Gideon realized something amazing. God didn't need the strongest, he just needed someone willing to say yes. Gideon stood on the hill, watching as the Midianites ran for their lives through the valley. Their shouts and panicked cries echoed in the night like thunder rolling through the hills. He turned to his men, who stood wide-eyed, breathing hard, still gripping their torches and horns. Gideon stepped forward, laughing in disbelief. "They're running! Gideon, they're really running! Look at them go!" Gideon's chest heaved as he looked at the valley. "We can't let them get away," he said, his voice suddenly steady and strong. "We have to finish what God started." He raised his arm high. "Follow me. We'll call the other tribes to help finish them off." His men cheered, tossing aside the broken jars and grabbing what weapons they could find among the Midianite supplies. They sprinted down the hillside, weaving through the wreckage of overturned tents and scattered supplies. Fires crackled, and abandoned shields lay everywhere. As they ran, Gideon sent messengers to the tribes of Ephraim and Naphtali, shouting, "Come, help us trap the Midianites before they cross the river. God has given them into our hands." Word spread quickly. Soon groups of Israelites began pouring out from the hillsides and villages, answering the call. Farmers carried hoes and pitchforks, young shepherds clutched slings and sticks, all running with fierce determination to join Gideon's charge. The Midianites, confused and terrified, kept tripping over each other, leaving behind gold, camels, and precious goods as they scrambled toward the Jordan River. Gideon led his men through the chaos, shouting directions and waving them forward. Dust filled the air, and the pounding of feet shook the ground. At one point, Gideon paused on a small ridge, breathing heavily. He looked out over the mass of running soldiers and the growing wave of Israelites joining the fight. For a moment he remembered that first night, hiding in a winepress, scared of his own shadow. Now, here he was, leading an army, shouting orders, standing strong in the middle of the battle. A small, amazed smile spread across his face. "God, you really can use anyone," he whispered, shaking his head, "even me." Below, the Israelites closed in, cutting off escape routes, shouting and driving the enemy back. The weak had become warriors. The scared had become strong. And Gideon, once the quietest, most hesitant man in his tribe, was leading them all in victory. The sun was rising over the hills, painting the sky in orange and pink. Gideon's men stood at the edge of the Jordan River, panting and dripping sweat. Their faces were streaked with dust, and their hands trembled from exhaustion. Gideon dropped to his knees at the riverbank, scooping water into his mouth as fast as he could. "We can't go any further!" He gasped between gulps. "We haven't eaten. We're finished." Gideon bent down, splashing cold water over his face and neck. He looked up at his men, eyes red, shoulders slumped. He felt the same exhaustion in his bones. His legs felt like they were made of clay and his stomach twisted from hunger. But then he turned and looked beyond the river, where the last of the Midianite kings were fleeing with their few remaining soldiers. Gideon's jaw tightened. "We can't stop now," he said, his voice rough but steady. "God gave us this victory. We have to finish it. We can't let them gather strength again and come back." Jethan looked up, eyes wide. "But we need food. We can't even stand straight." Gideon nodded. "I know. We'll ask for help." He led his men to a nearby town called Succoth. He stood before the elders there, still holding his sword, his voice strong despite his shaking limbs. "Please," Gideon said. "My men are exhausted. We are chasing the Midianite kings, Zeba and Zalmunna. Give us bread so we can keep going." The elders glanced at each other, eyes uncertain. One stepped forward slowly. "You haven't captured them yet," he said cautiously. "What if they escape and come back for revenge? Then they'll punish us for helping you." Gideon's eyes darkened, but he held himself steady. "When the Lord gives them into my hand," he said, "I'll come back, and you'll answer for your choice." They turned him away with cold faces. Gideon led his men to another town, Peniel, and asked the same. The answer was the same: fear and refusal. Gideon's men groaned and leaned against their spears. "We're done," one whispered. "We can't keep going." Gideon turned, his voice sharp but full of quiet fire. "Listen to me," he called out. "This is God's battle. He has carried us this far. He will carry us the rest of the way. Even if we crawl, we will finish this." One by one, the men lifted their heads. Their eyes were tired, but beginning to burn with new courage. Jethan stood first, gripping his sword tight. "Then let's crawl if we have to," he said, teeth gritted, "for the Lord and for Gideon." The others echoed the cry, voices growing stronger, echoing across the river. With the sun climbing higher behind them, Gideon led his weary but unbreakable band across the Jordan, every step forward a testament that God's strength shines brightest when his people feel weakest. The sun blazed high as Gideon and his 300 men staggered across the dusty plains beyond the Jordan. Their legs felt heavy as stones, their mouths dry as sand. But their eyes stayed locked on the small group of Midianite soldiers up ahead, the last of the enemy, including the two kings, Zeba and Zalmunna. Gideon narrowed his eyes. He could see them riding fast, looking over their shoulders every few moments, panic written all over their faces. "We're close!" Gideon shouted, lifting his sword. "They're tired too. Don't let up now." Jethan limped forward beside him, sweat pouring down his face. "How are we still moving?" he gasped. Gideon turned, breathless but smiling faintly. "Not our strength," he panted. "God's." The men grinned weakly, gripping their swords and pushing forward one more time. As they closed the gap, the Midianites turned to fight one last time, but they were unprepared, scattered, and afraid. Gideon raised his arm, roaring, "For the Lord and for Israel!" The 300 crashed into the enemy lines with surprising power, swords flashing in the sun. Midianite soldiers stumbled over each other, too shocked and exhausted to fight back properly. In the chaos, Gideon spotted Zebah and Zalmunna slipping away on horseback. His eyes flared with determination. "After them!" he yelled. He sprinted forward, dirt flying behind him. His lungs burned, but he didn't slow down. Every step felt like it might be his last, but he knew he couldn't stop. Finally, Gideon caught up to the kings. He leaped forward and grabbed Zalmunna's reins, jerking the horse to a halt. With a fierce pull, he threw the king to the ground. Jathan and a few others surrounded Zebah, forcing him off his horse too. The two kings fell to their knees, shaking, dust covering their fine robes. Gideon stood over them, sword in hand, breathing hard. His shadow stretched across the ground, sharp and bold. "You took our food," Gideon said, voice low but strong. "You took our harvests. You tried to take our hope, but you will not rise against God's people again." The kings looked up, fear freezing them in place. Gideon raised his sword. With one final shout, he brought it down, ending the threat once and for all. Silence spread across the field. Only the wind moved, whispering through the grass. Gideon lowered his sword slowly, sweat and tears mixing on his face. His men stood around him, breathing hard, eyes wide with awe and relief. Jathan dropped his sword to the ground and fell to his knees. "We did it," he choked out. "God really used us, even us." Gideon nodded, too overwhelmed to speak for a moment. He looked up at the sky, heart pounding with gratitude. "It was always you, Lord," he whispered. "Always you." With the Midianite kings defeated, Gideon and his men gathered in a quiet circle. They sat in the dusty field, too tired even to cheer. Jathan leaned back, breathing heavily, and looked up at the sky. "I can't believe it's over," he mumbled. "I thought we were goners for sure." Gideon wiped sweat from his forehead and looked around at the exhausted faces. Every man there carried cuts, bruises, and dirt, but their eyes glowed with a quiet victory. "God did it," Gideon said softly. "He didn't need a big army, just willing hearts." Jathan grinned and nodded. "I guess he really doesn't need the strongest, just the ones who say yes." The men laughed weakly, some wiping tears from their eyes. Soon they gathered their things and began the long walk home. Every step felt heavy, but every heart felt light. When they reached the first town, Succoth, the same elders who had refused to help now rushed out, eyes wide. Gideon stepped forward, sword still in his hand, and the elders froze. "You remember when we came to ask for bread?" Gideon asked, his voice calm but strong. "You turned us away because you didn't believe God would give us victory." The elders looked at the ground, their faces pale. Gideon took a slow breath. "God delivered the kings into our hands without your help. Now the people will know that fear and doubt only hold us back." The elders bowed low, trembling. Gideon didn't raise his sword. He simply turned away and walked on, leaving them with the lesson written on their hearts. In Peniel, the same thing happened. The people came out, eyes wide with surprise and fear. But Gideon kept moving forward, focused on God's victory instead of revenge. As they passed through the towns, people began to follow behind them. Children pointed and cheered, and mothers held out food and water for the tired soldiers. Old men shook Gideon's hand and patted his shoulders, shouting blessings. By the time they neared their home, a crowd trailed behind them like a river of joy. Jathan walked beside Gideon, shaking his head in disbelief. "Remember when you hid in that winepress scared to death?" he teased with a crooked grin. Gideon laughed for the first time in days, the sound echoing over the hills. "I remember," he said. "I was the last person I thought God would ever choose." Gideon bumped his shoulder. "Guess that's exactly why he did." Gideon nodded, looking ahead at the road winding toward his home. In that moment, he understood something deeper than any victory shout. God doesn't look for the biggest or the loudest, he looks for the willing, even if they're afraid at first. When Gideon and his 300 men finally reached their hometown, the people came pouring out of every doorway. Children ran ahead, waving sticks like swords. Old women clapped their hands and shouted blessings. Fathers lifted their kids onto their shoulders to see the heroes return. Gideon stepped forward, smiling, though he still looked tired and dusty from the journey. Gideon walked beside him, grinning from ear to ear. A group of elders pushed through the crowd and dropped to their knees before Gideon. "Gideon!" one elder cried out. "You saved us! You delivered us from Midian's hand! You must rule over us! You, your sons, and your grandsons!" The crowd cheered loudly, voices echoing off the hills. Gideon elbowed Gideon playfully. "Well, look at that! They want a king!" But Gideon shook his head immediately. His face turned serious, and he lifted his hand to quiet the noise. "No," he said firmly, his voice clear and strong. "I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." A hush fell over the crowd. Some people looked confused. Others stared at him in awe. Gideon stepped closer to them, his eyes soft but steady. "You saw what happened," he said. "We didn't win because I was strong or because we had the best army. We won because God fought for us. He alone is your king." The people looked at each other, whispering. Slowly, heads began to nod. Some elders wiped tears from their eyes. A young boy near the front called out, "But Gideon, you're still our hero." Gideon knelt down to the boy's level and smiled. "I'm only a servant," he said gently. "The real hero is God." The boy's eyes lit up, and he grinned proudly. Gideon stepped forward, shaking his head in amazement. "I don't know if I could turn down being king," he admitted quietly. Gideon laughed and put an arm around his friend's shoulders. "That's exactly why I had to," he said. "It was never supposed to be about me." As the crowd began to celebrate again, this time cheering for God instead of just Gideon, he stood there in the middle, finally feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He realized that true victory wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about keeping the glory where it belonged, with God alone. After the celebrations faded and the cheering quieted, the people slowly returned to their homes. Gideon stood in the center of town, watching families sweep their doorways, children chase each other with sticks, and neighbors share bread and stories. For the first time in years, there was laughter instead of cries. There was rest instead of fear. Gideon walked up beside Gideon, wiping crumbs from his beard. "So, what now?" he asked. "No more battles. No more hiding in caves. It almost feels strange." Gideon looked out at the peaceful scene and nodded slowly. "Now, we build. We teach. We remind everyone that it was God who saved us." Gideon grinned. "You sound more like a teacher than a warrior." Gideon chuckled. "Maybe that's what we need most right now." As days turned into weeks, people often came to Gideon for advice. They asked how to settle arguments, how to share land, and how to live in peace. Gideon always pointed them back to God's laws and reminded them that they belonged to Him, not to any human ruler. But even in times of peace, tests still came. Some people began to collect gold from the Midianite spoils, shaping it into jewelry and ornaments. One day, they brought Gideon some of the gold and begged him to make an ephod, a special garment usually worn by priests. At first, Gideon hesitated, but eventually he agreed, thinking it might help the people remember God's victory. However, soon the people started visiting the ephod more than they prayed. They treated it like a lucky charm instead of honoring God. Gideon watched all this with a heavy heart. He realized that even good intentions could twist into distractions if people forgot to keep their eyes on God. One night, Gideon sat outside his home, staring at the stars. Gideon sat beside him, silent, for a long time. Finally, Gideon spoke. "Did we really win, Gideon? The battle is over, but the people's hearts, they wander so easily." Gideon sighed deeply. "Winning a battle is easier than winning hearts forever," he said. "Only God can truly keep them faithful." Gideon nodded, looking down at the dirt. "But we did our part," Gideon added, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We obeyed when we were scared. We trusted when it made no sense. That's all God asked of us." Gideon smiled faintly. "That's enough," he said. Gideon looked out at the quiet village, knowing the road ahead would still be full of challenges. But in that moment, under the endless sky, he felt at peace, because he knew he had followed God's voice even when it shook him to the core. The years passed quietly. The fields grew full again. The animals returned to the hills, and children laughed in the streets instead of hiding in caves. Gideon grew older, his hair turning gray and his hands rougher than ever. But his eyes still held that same sharp light, the same quiet strength that had carried him through the impossible. At night, he sat outside his home with his many sons gathered around him. They loved hearing stories, especially about the night of the torches and trumpets. "Tell us again, Father," one of the younger boys begged, bouncing on his toes. Gideon laughed, leaning back against the wall. "You've heard it 1,000 times, he teased. The boy shook his head eagerly. "Tell it again." So Gideon took a deep breath and began. He described the crashing jars, the sudden flames, the wild sound of the trumpets in the dark. He told them how the Midianites ran away in terror and how God had fought the battle for them. As he spoke, his sons leaned in, their eyes shining wide like the stars overhead. When he finished, silence fell for a moment. Then one of the older boys spoke up, his voice soft but strong. "Father, were you afraid?" Gideon looked at the boy for a long time, the question echoing deep in his chest. "Yes," he said honestly. "I was terrified. I felt too weak, I felt too small. But that's when I learned something important. God doesn't choose the strongest or the loudest. He chooses the ones who listen and obey even when they're scared." The boys looked at each other, thinking about his words. Gideon rested a hand on the oldest boy's shoulder. "If you remember anything from my life, remember this: God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. It was never really about me. It was always about Him." A soft breeze drifted through the yard, rustling the olive trees and carrying the scent of ripening fruit. One by one, the boys stood and hugged their father before heading off to bed. Gideon stayed seated, looking up at the night sky. Memories of battles, fears, and miracles played through his mind like a gentle river. He realized that his true legacy wasn't in the trophies of war or the treasures left behind. It was in the hearts of those he had taught to trust God. A warm peace filled his chest. Even with mistakes, even with doubts, he had shown them that courage isn't about feeling strong. It's about saying yes to God's call. And in that quiet moment under the stars, Gideon felt a whisper of God's presence, a soft reminder that the story was never really his alone. Time moved gently over the land. Seasons came and went, and Gideon grew slower. His sons took on more of the work in the fields, and his neighbors often came to him for advice instead of for battle plans. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Gideon sat on a small stool outside his home, listening to the songs of birds and the distant laughter of children. Gideon, older now too, came to sit beside him. He carried a small loaf of bread and handed it over with a grin. "Still the best bread in town," Gideon said, breaking off a piece. Gideon chuckled, taking a bite. "And you're still my oldest friend," he replied. They sat quietly for a while, the sky deepening into twilight. Gideon looked over at Gideon, his face thoughtful. "Do you ever wish you'd become king, taken the power they offered you?" Gideon shook his head slowly. "No," he said firmly. "I was never meant to sit on a throne. I was meant to point to the one true king. God didn't want me to wear a crown. He wanted me to trust him." Gideon smiled and nodded. "You did that, my friend. You really did." Gideon took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He looked out over the peaceful village, the olive trees swaying in the soft breeze. He thought of the winepress where it all began, the fear, the doubts, the hidden man who thought he was nobody. Then he thought of the torches and trumpets, the crashing jars, the wild victory. Most of all, he thought of God's voice, gentle, patient, strong. A voice that believed in him before he believed in himself. Gideon turned to Gideon, his eyes soft but shining. "Promise me you'll remind them," he said. "Remind them that it was God's strength, not mine. Tell them that even the smallest, most afraid person can do great things if they trust him." Gideon reached out and squeezed his friend's hand. "I promise," he whispered. That night, as the stars blinked awake above the village, Gideon felt a deep peace settle over him like a warm blanket. He knew his time was almost over, but he also knew his story would live on, not just as a story of battle, but as a story of trust. A story that told every listener, God uses the weak and hesitant when they depend on his strength. Gideon closed his eyes, a small smile on his lips. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the songs of the night and the whispers of old friends, he rested, strong at last. Not because of his own might, but because he had learned to lean fully on God.